Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Welcome to this special deep dive, everyone. We know you are probably staring down a massive genetics exam right now, so today is basically your last-minute lecture.
Yeah, we are here to help you conquer Chapter 9, which is all about bacterial and viral genetic systems.
Right, and our mission is to decode all those dense experiments, the mapping problems, the molecular pathways, and just put them into plain, accessible language.
Exactly. We're going to follow the exact layout of the textbook so you can track right along with us.
And to hook you right away, I want to start with a really fascinating case study from the chapter. It's about medieval leprosy.
Oh, yeah. Mycobacterium leprae. That is such a wild biological anomaly.
It really is. In 2013, geneticists actually extracted DNA from the skeletons of these medieval leprosy victims across Europe. And you'd think, a pathogen that survives for centuries would be getting stronger, right? Building a better genetic arsenal.
You would completely assume that, yeah.
But no. What they found completely breaks our basic assumptions of evolution. The bacterium hasn't been improving at all. It's actually been experiencing this massive evolutionary decay.
It's essentially rotting from the inside out. When they sequenced that ancient DNA and compared it to modern strains, they found it's missing about 1 million base pairs compared to its close relatives.
Wow, 1 million?
Yeah, and today, only 50% of its DNA actually encodes functional proteins.
Which is, incredibly low for a bacterium, right? They usually run these really tight, highly efficient genetic ships.
They really do. In most bacteria, almost all the DNA codes for something useful. But in leprosy, a staggering 27% of the genome is just pseudogenes.
Pseudogenes, so like...
They're genetic ghosts, basically. Just mutated, broken, non-functional copies of genes taking up space.
Okay, so what happens when, a quarter of an organism's instruction manual is just gibberish?
Well, it becomes completely dependent on its host. It's lost so many functional genes that it can't produce its own essential nutrients anymore. It has to steal them from human cells.
That sounds exhausting for the bacterium.
It is. This catastrophic decay is why it has an agonizingly slow generation time. It takes 14 days just to divide one single time.
Wait, 14 days just to double?
Yes. For context, some E. coli strains double every 20 minutes. And this is exactly why scientists notoriously cannot culture leprosy in a lab.
Right, it just won't grow on a standard agar plate no matter what nutrients you give it.
Precisely. It simply refuses to grow.
And that biological quirk basically sets up our whole core question for today. If we have this bacterium that we literally cannot grow in a petri dish, how do geneticists even know it's there? Like, how do we study the genetics of the millions of species out there?
It's a huge question because we are truly living in a bacterial world. Ocean bacteria produce 50% of the oxygen we breathe.
Yeah, and you have roughly 10 trillion bacteria in your gut alone?
Easily, yeah. And for the longest time, we drastically underestimated bacterial diversity because we relied so heavily on culturing. We thought, well, if it doesn't grow in the lab, it must not exist.
Until molecular techniques came along and just blew the lid off that whole assumption. There's this landmark study in 2007 by Louis Roche where his team looked at soil, and not like a whole field, just 1 single gram of Canadian soil.
Literally a pinch of dirt.
Right, a pinch. So what do they do differently?
Well, they bypassed the Petri dish entirely. They just extracted all the raw DNA straight from that dirt and sequenced a specific marker called the 16S rRNA gene.
The 16S RNA.
Yes, it acts like a molecular barcode. Okay. It's unique to different bacterial species. And in that tiny pinch of dirt, they identified over 53,000 different types of bacterial DNA.
That is it's mind-blowing. Tens of thousands of distinct species from 1 gram.
Exactly, and the vast majority of them we can't even culture. So that study proved that molecular analysis is absolutely essential.
Okay, so barcodes handle the unculturable ones. But for the bacteria we can actually grow, how do we study their genetics? Your textbook talks a lot about prototrophs and autotrophs.
Right, those are key terms you need to know.
Let's break them down with an analogy. So think of prototrophs, the wild type, normal bacteria as like from-scratch chefs. If you give them a minimal medium, which is just water, some basic carbon like glucose, and salts,
They will synthesize absolutely every complex molecule they need to survive. They have the complete set of genetic instructions to build every amino acid, every vitamin from scratch.
Exactly. But then you have mutant strains, the auxotrophs. Think of them as people who completely rely on meal kits.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, because a mutation has broken one of their metabolic pathways.
Yeah.
So let's say an auxotroph can't make the amino acid leucine. If you put it on a bare bones minimal medium, it's going to starve and die.
Right. It only survives if you give it a complete medium, your meal kit, where the leucine is already prepackaged for it.
So how do geneticists actually use that vulnerability to find mutants?
They use a brilliant, beautifully low-tech method called replica plating. Let's say we want to find a lewd auxotroph, a mutant that can't make leucine.
Because you definitely can't just look at a million cells under a microscope and spot the hungry one.
No, you have to use their phenotype to reveal them. You start by growing a big population on a complete medium plate with plenty of leucine. Every cell grows into a visible colony.
But here's the trick, right? If you just scrape them onto a minimal plate to see who dies, you lose your mutants. They're dead.
Exactly. You destroy the very thing you want to study. So you have to keep a backup. You take a sterile piece of velvet stretched over a block, and you gently press it onto your master plate.
Like a stamp.
Yes. The velvet fibers are like tiny needles. They pick up an invisible footprint of cells from every colony, keeping their exact spatial arrangement. Then you press that velvet stamp onto a second plate, a minimal medium that completely lacks leucine.
Oh, I see. So you let that second plate grow, and then you just place spot the difference.
Precisely. The from-scratch prototrophs grow on both. But if there's a colony on the complete plate that mysteriously fails to show up on the minimal plate...
That's your mutant. That missing colony is the leucoxotroph. And since you have your master plate, you just go back and isolate it.
It's so elegant. Now, all these metabolic instructions are coded in the bacterial genome, which is usually a single, circular, double-stranded DNA molecule.
Right, but they also have bonus material, don't they? The plasmids.
Yes, plasmids are tiny extra chromosomal circles of DNA. They aren't essential for everyday survival, but they carry cheat codes like antibiotic resistance, and they are highly mobile.
Which kind of brings up a huge paradox. Because bacteria reproduces asexually, right? Through binary fission, just cloning themselves.
One cell splits into two identical daughters.
But evolution needs genetic variation. If they're just cloning themselves endlessly, how are they getting new traits?
Through horizontal gene transfer. Instead of passing genes vertically from parent to offspring, they pass genes horizontally to their neighbors, sometimes even to different species.
And the textbook gives three main mechanisms for this. Let's tackle the first one, conjugation.
Conjugation requires direct physical contact between two living cells. And the proof for this is Joshua Lederberg and Edward Tatum's 1946 experiment.
Oh, right. They took two different auxotrophic strains. Let's call them strain A and strain B. Strain A was broken and couldn't make, say, threonine and leucine.
And strain B had totally different mutations. It couldn't make biotin and phenylalanine.
Neither could grow on minimal media alone. But they mixed them in a flask, let them mingle, and then plated them. And suddenly they got fully functional prototrophic colonies.
They can make everything from scratch again.
Okay, put on your skeptical student hat for a second. Couldn't those bacteria have just spontaneously mutated back to normal?
You have to look at the statistics to rule that out. A spontaneous reversion mutation for a single gene is incredibly rare, like 1 in 10 million.
Right.
But here, we're tracking multiple broken genes at once. For a bacterium to spontaneously fix 2 or 3 specific broken genes at the exact same moment, the odds are closer to 1 in 100 trillion.
It's just mathematically impossible. So they had to be sharing functional genes to compensate for each other's mutations.
Exactly. And Bernard Davis proved the physical contact requirement with his U-tube experiment. He put strain A in one arm of a U-shaped tube and strain B in the other.
Separated by a microscopic filter, right?
Yes. Fluid could pass, but the cells couldn't touch. Result, 0 prototrophs. They absolutely have to touch.
So how do they actually do the microscopic handshake?
It comes back to those plasmids, specifically the F factor or fertility factor. A cell with this plasmid is an F+ cell, and it builds a sex pilus.
Basically a retractable grappling hook.
Exactly. It latches onto an F cell, pulls it in tight, and forms a hollow tube. Then the F+ cell nicks its circular plasmid, unspools a single strand of DNA, and threads it right through the tube into the neighbor.
Like a ticker tape. And geneticists actually figured out how to use this unspooling process to map the chromosome, didn't they?
They did, using interrupted conjugation. Sometimes the F factor accidentally integrates into the main bacterial chromosome. This creates an HSR cell high frequency of recombination.
So when an HFR cell builds a bridge, it doesn't just send a small plasmid. It tries to drag its entire massive chromosome across.
Right, but it takes about 100 minutes to drag the whole thing, and the physical bridge is incredibly fragile.
So scientists in the lab weaponize that fragility. They literally put the conjugating bacteria into a blender.
Yes. The shearing force of the blender snaps the microscopic bridges instantly. So if you stop the blender at 10 minutes, only the first few genes made it across.
And if you run it for 25 minutes, more genes cross. So you just track which traits appear at 10, 20, or 30 minutes, and time literally becomes a measure of distance on the chromosome.
It's a brilliant mapping technique. But what if there's no contact? What if a cell just dies and bursts open?
Well, then you have naked DNA floating around. And that's our second mechanism, transformation. This is when bacteria scavenge naked DNA fragments from their environment and integrate them.
And transformation gives us a different kind of mapping puzzle. Let's walk through a COT transformation problem.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine we have a donor strain with 5 functional genes, A, B, C, D, and E. We chop its DNA into tiny fragments and mix it with a mutant recipient that has broken versions of all 5.
And we want to see which functional genes the recipient sweeps up together, which ones are co-transformed.
Exactly. The rule here is proximity. If 2 genes are right next to each other on the original chromosome, they'll likely survive the chopping process on the exact same tiny fragment.
So they get swallowed together. But if they're far apart, they end up on different fragments, and the odds of grabbing both are basically 0.
Right. So let's say our data shows gene C is frequently co-transformed with gene D, and C is also frequently co-transformed with E.
Okay, so if C's with D, they're neighbors. If C's with E, they're neighbors too.
But the final piece of data says D and E are literally never co-transformed together.
So C is close to D and close to E, but D and E are far apart. That means C has to be exactly in the middle.
You nailed it. The order must be DCE. You just apply that spatial deduction down the line.
I love how satisfying that logic is. So we've got grappling hooks, we've got scavenging naked DNA. But the third way they share genes is a lot more chaotic. Transduction.
Right. Transduction is where viruses act as unwilling couriers, accidentally packaging up bacterial DNA and injecting it into a new host.
Which raises a really obvious question for you. If billions of viruses are constantly injecting random, often lethal instructions into bacteria, why aren't the bacteria all dead?
Because of a vicious evolutionary arms race. Bacteria have sophisticated defenses. The first line is the restriction-modification system. They produce restriction enzymes.
Those are the molecular scissors, right?
Yes. They scan for specific viral DNA sequences and chop them to pieces. But to protect its own DNA from getting shredded by friendly fire, the bacterium adds methyl groups to its own chromosome.
So the methyl groups are like armor against the scissors.
Exactly. But viruses mutate incredibly fast to avoid the scissors. So bacteria evolved an adaptive immune system. CRISPR-Cas.
Oh, this is my favorite part. I always think of the CRISPR array as a molecular mugshot wall.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. The array has these identical, repeating palindromic DNA sequences.
And a palindrome folds back on itself, forming little hairpin loops.
Right. And between those loops are unique stretches of DNA called spacers. These are the mugshots. They're tiny fragments of DNA that the bacterium stole from a virus during a past failed attack.
It literally filed the viral DNA away for future reference. So when that same virus attacks again, the bacterium transcribes the mugshot into an RNA molecule, a crRNA.
And it hands that RNA mugshot to a Cas protein, which acts as the executioner. Cas protein uses the crRNA to scan incoming DNA. If it finds a perfect match, it precisely slices the invading genome in 2.
Boom, neutralized.
Yeah.
So to understand this war, we have to look at the viral playbook. These bacteriophages, the viruses that infect bacteria, they have 2 main life cycles.
Right, the lysogenic cycle and the lysogenic cycle. Lytic is the smash and grab. The virus injects its DNA, hijacks the ribosomes, builds hundreds of copies, and then violently lyses or explodes the cell.
But lysogenic is way sneakier.
Much sneakier. The viral DNA quietly integrates directly into the host's chromosome. It becomes a prophage, basically a sleeper agent.
And every time the bacterium divides, it naturally copies the viral DNA along with its own, completely unaware.
Right.
Until some stress triggers it to wake up and launch the lytic cycle.
Exactly. And understanding these cycles is how Hershey and Rotman mapped viral genes back in 1949 with the T2 phage.
Mapping a virus sounds impossible, and they're so tiny. How did they do it?
They used a brilliant crossing technique. They looked at two mutant traits. One was host range, designated H, and the other was plaque morphology.
And a plaque is just the clear, empty zone on a petri dish where a virus exploded a bunch of bacteria, right?
Right, so they floated a single bacterial cell with both types of mutant viruses at the same time. Inside the cell, the DNA from the two strains crossed over and recombined.
And then the cell bursts, they collect the new viruses, and literally just count the plaques.
You just do the math. Recombinant plaques divided by total plaques gives you the recombination frequency. A higher frequency means the genes are physically further apart on the viral chromosome.
So simple, yet so effective. And this brings us to the final textbook puzzle, transduction mapping.
Yes, using the virus's messy packaging habits to map the bacterial genes. Let's work through this. We want to map 3 E. coli genes, EHR, ARA, and LU.
Okay, the logic is like transformation. When the virus packs its shell, it accidentally stuffs a tiny fragment of host DNA inside.
And the viral shell has a strict size limit. So if 2 bacterial genes are packaged together, if they are co-transduced, they must be extremely close neighbors.
All right, let's look at the numbers. The data shows LU and ARA are co-transduced 76% of the time, but LU and Thor are only co-transduced 3% of the time.
High percentage means physical proximity. Low percentage means distance.
So 76% means LU and ARA are basically touching. They always fit in the shell together. The 3% means LU and Thor are far apart.
Now we just need the exact linear order. The final data point. The co-transduction rate between Thor and ARA is exactly 0%.
Boom. They are never picked up together, so they are the furthest apart. If LU is next to ARA and Thor is far from LU and even further from ARA, Thor must be on the complete opposite side of LU.
Exactly. The linear order is Thor-LU-ARA.
Spatial logic holds up perfectly. And, while we've been talking about bacteriophages, these viral mechanics apply to human diseases too.
Absolutely. Think about retroviruses like HIV. They carry an RNA genome, not DNA. But to hijack a human cell, they have to integrate into our DNA chromosome.
Which means they have to use reverse transcriptase.
Right, which completely breaks the central dogma of biology. Information is supposed to flow from DNA to RNA to protein.
But reverse transcriptase runs it backward. It reads the viral RNA and synthesizes DNA, which then inserts into our chromosome as a provirus.
Operating just like the bacterial sleeper agents. And then you have RNA viruses like influenza, which are famous for mutating so rapidly.
Yeah, why do we need a new flu shot every single year?
Because of antigenic drift, which is just the slow accumulation of minor mutations. But antigenic shift is what causes terrifying global pandemics.
How does the shift happen?
Well, the flu genome is segmented into separate pieces of RNA. If a pig, for example, is infected by a bird flu and a human flu at the exact same time.
Oh, wow.
Those separate segments can shuffle and mix together inside the pig cells, and a completely novel viral strain emerges that human immune systems have zero experience with.
It's literally shuffling the genetic deck, which honestly brings us full circle to the whole theme of this chapter.
It does. It leads to a truly profound biological realization because horizontal gene transfer is so common through conjugation, transformation, and transduction. A single bacterial chromosome is actually a patchwork mosaic.
I read that up to 17% of the standard E. coli genome was acquired horizontally from entirely different species.
Exactly. If genetic material flows sideways across the tree of life, our traditional concept of a species completely breaks down.
Because we usually define a species as a reproductively isolated group.
Right, but in the microbial world, isolation is a myth. The borders between species are completely fluid.
That is just wild to think about. So, the next time you sit down to study evolution, don't just picture a neat straight line of inheritance. Picture that chaotic mosaic.
Keep that medieval leprosy bacterium in your mind, rotting away its own genome, while trillions of other microbes are furiously trading genetic cheat codes.
And trust the spatial logic when you do those mapping problems.
Yeah.
You've got this. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. From all of us on the Last Minute Lecture team, good luck on your exams.